How do we move on after setback, after loss, after death? Well, these questions are the focus of this month's anime retrospective, Haibane Renmei, and while they may seem like very grim questions to open a retrospective on, they are the central theme of a series, which is actually surprisingly uplifting and pleasant. In fact, Haibane Renmei is one of the most pleasant things I've ever seen on this channel, and something I would definitely recommend anyone watch. It's a beautiful and atmospheric piece, centering on Rakka, Reiki, and finding inner peace. Now getting into opening thoughts, Haibane Renmei is an extremely unique blend of surreal setting and atmosphere, philosophical theories on forgiveness, slice of life scenes, moving on, and an all-around pleasant atmosphere. It somehow manages to make a story about dead children in purgatory into a surprisingly cozy, pleasant, and impactful tale about personal growth, getting over loss, and even growing up, which is a tad ironic considering the literal context here, but the setup gives HR a very unique setting, as its slow-paced and thoughtful narrative centers more on individual growth and themes than any sort of massive concrete plot. Yes, there is a concrete plot here, but it centers on the small but impactful and important interactions of Rakka and later Reiki learning to forgive themselves and move on. And this is accomplished through everyday things and not some great or grand scheme or lore here. There's no antagonist here, and there isn't really much of a ticking clock until about the final 4 episodes or so. And yet HR, which I'm going to refer to the series from now on because I can't pronounce it properly most of the time, still manages a very thoughtful and compelling narrative in spite of these quirks. It's exactly how you would want to create an atmospheric story, as it has enough plot to keep things going and keep everything together, but not too much plot as to distract from the main points of the show, which are its themes and character interactions. And these interactions and the way they are written add a great amount of charm and great advice to the series as a whole. Talking about the actual writing of the series for a second, I also think that this is another unique thing we should briefly touch on. HR had a rather unique creation story, as it started as a doshinji by Yoshitoshi Abe. Now, while the word dojin has a rather unique set of connotations to Western audiences, it literally just translates as self-published, and HR has no explicit material, even if it does cover some mature themes like self-harm. Abe himself stated that the reason he initially published HR as a dojin was simply so that people, and perhaps a media company, wouldn't constantly pester him for answers about a tale which is obviously supposed to be rather open-ended and open to interpretation. This unfinished dojin was later adopted by Radix Ace Entertainment into the masterpiece we see before us. And while the anime is an extension of this dojin, as it was never completed because they went right into the production of the anime, the independent nature of HR's creation is still very evident and lends a very organic and special feel to the series as a whole. It feels like a published piece of outsider art, something of course which it isn't because Abe is a trained and professional artist, but something which still stands out nonetheless. HR loves its surreal elements, its bizarre premise, and everything about it feels deliberate and very passion-filled. There is a ton of heart that went into this piece, and it's very warm, in spite of the fact that much of its setup seems to hint at a darker story. A darker story which we never see, because Haibane Renmei is a very hope-filled story, and a story of learning to love not only others, but oneself, and move on past personal regrets and issues that we can no longer change, but we can move beyond. Hope always prevails here, and this anime is the anime equivalent of a nice warm blanket. It has a very cozy feel, and if you want an extremely unique and atmospheric piece, like say Technolize or Surreal Experiments Lane, but also one with a much warmer tone, then HR is definitely the show for you. And oddly enough, Technolize is the first piece that this reminded me of, although I acknowledge that they're very different. If I had to guess, I'd probably say that's because they both take place in some kind of weird purgatory, although in Technolize it's a metaphorical one, and in here it's a literal one. I do recognize that they're very different, but this through line did captivate me, and I'd also like to see a sequel where Ron and Ichise learn how to be good Haibanes, but that's neither here nor there. I've only seen HR as an adult. However, its uplifting charm, positive messages, and overall production value are still very clear to me, and I think that it is one of the most feel-good anime I've seen in a while, if not ever. I don't think that this could impact anyone negatively, and I think that it's a great piece for you to watch whether you just want something nice to relax to, or you're genuinely going through something, because a lot of the messages here are genuinely impactful and pleasant, if honest at times. I herald this as a piece which could very easily have a great positive impact on a soul that's still developing, or one which just needs a little pick-me-up and would like to be reminded that not everything is doom and gloom. I would recommend this piece whether or not you're going through something, and I think it's beautiful on both a technical and a thematic level. It is a wonderful, soulful work of art, detailing people overcoming their own internal stumbling blocks, and showing that hope can and does prevail. Now, getting to a brief plot overview, one of Haibane Renmei's defining traits is that there isn't much of a plot. There's no grand overarching scheme or even much of a ticking clock for most of the series, and most of the mystery of the world is just a thing that's acknowledged and not really dwelt on past a certain point. Instead, what we get here is a small-scale and intimate series of events pertaining to Rakka and later Reiki learning to forgive themselves and eventually move on. The entirety of the story takes place in the village of Gile, I think that's how they pronounce it, and its adjacent locales, all of which are surrounded by massive walls. Now the Haibane, or any of the humans here for that reason, are not allowed past these walls, and the Haibane themselves live in special nests. Although they do work jobs in the town full of normal humans and are generally seen as respectable and lucky creatures. It is here, in Old Home, that we witness the story of Rakka. We open with her in a dream plunging towards the ground. It is in this dream that a crow tries to stop her descent, although Rakka accepts that it cannot, thanks the bird for attempting anyways, and then plunges down. Upon waking from this dream, she emerges from her cocoon in Old Home. Now Old Home is where the Haibane, a group of youth with angel-like wings and halos, lives, and it is here that Rakka will live and meet the rest of the cast. The supporting cast consists of the kind-hearted Ku, the sarcastic Kanna, diligent Hikari, calm Nemu, and the pseudo-leader of the group, the jaded, cynical, but ultimately well-meaning and caring, Reiki. These Haibane help Rakka adjust to her new life as a Haibane, and navigate important tasks like finding a job and fitting in. While Rakka is making progress in her new life though, her mentor Ku suddenly ascends to the next stage of being a Haibane, and disappears from the village forever. Now while what this ascension is intentionally not defined, it is hinted to be something akin to redemption or nirvana or ascending to heaven or enlightenment or something along those lines, while Old Town itself is akin to some kind of purgatory where the Haibane can outgrow their flaws. Anyways, Ku's departure hits Rakka especially hard, and in the midst of her despair, she starts to take some rather short-sighted actions. Her wings become black and, quote, sin-bound, as she's unable to get over the loss of Ku even months and months later. Now, it's important for the context of the series to note that, in this case, sin-bound does not mean that Rakka partook in any willingly malicious action, but there's some kind of darkness in her. In the context of the show, sin can often be interpreted as darkness. So when they say she's sin-bound, they mean that she is bound by the darkness in her heart that she cannot get over. This isn't necessarily any proof of malfeasance or malice on Rakka's part, but it is just simply to state that there's darkness in her that she needs to get over. Rakka is haunted by her inability to know what happened to Ku, and her quest for answers leads to several ill-advised actions. Among these is touching the wall itself, something strictly forbidden, and venturing out into the forest herself, again something forbidden. It is in the forest that she finds a well, which she falls down, and finds the remains of the crow from her dream. Now it seems that this crow specifically followed Rakka in an attempt to forgive her for some unspecified past transgression, and this encounter and burying the crow helps her literally bury the past and move on. She acknowledges it, but she learns that she can't change it and can't dwell on it. She starts to accept Ku's departure as simply the way of the world, and this, and some advice from the Haibane Elder, help Rakka realize the importance of moving on and not lingering on past regrets or pains. She even gets a job at the Haibane Temple, and it is here that the Elder informs her that Reiki is running out of time to ascend. You see, if a Haibane doesn't ascend past a certain point, they are doomed to lose their wings and live out the rest of their life in a sort of semi-secluded state here in Gile. It's implied that this is what happened to the Elder. Something is still bothering Reiki, and her lingering on it is what is preventing her from ascending, something which must be done soon, lest she be unable to ascend at all at any point. With this in mind, Rakka starts to pay more attention to Reiki and notice her own inner turmoil and the brave face that she puts on around others. This point marks a paradigm shift in the dynamics of the series, as it goes from one in which Reiki cares for Rakka to one where Rakka cares for Reiki. This shows that Rakka has not only grown out of her personal issue, but also that she's truly grown as a person and seeks to help someone who has helped her so much. The need to help Reiki ascend before time runs out also adds a sort of ticking clock element to the final episodes of the series, even adding some urgency. Luckily though, Rakka does succeed in helping Reiki reconcile with those she hurt in the past, and reconcile with herself, helping her move on and open her heart to others so she finally doesn't feel so alone anymore and can ascend to the next stage of being a Haibane. In the final episode, Reiki does ascend, all the while the rest of the Haibane remark on how happy they are for her and their desire to reunite with her one day. The final scene cuts to a little while later, where Rakka now seems to be taking Reiki's place in the old home, and is quite happy to be looking after the next generation of Haibane. Now, Haibane Renmei has mastered the art of the small-scale plot. It knows what the focus here is supposed to be, and that focus is supposed to be on the characters and the themes. The plot is simply to convey these and keep everything moving at a nice pace. The small scale of the plot is a strength of the show, as it allows an intimate focus on the human progression here, the main point of the series. From a production standpoint, it also means that the series can easily accomplish all that it wants to without risking any kind of pacing issues. A small scale plot means that even though the series is only 13 episodes long, we can still complete everything in a timely manner. And it also allows character growth, themes, and atmosphere to stick out more to the viewer. These themes even allow the series to get away with not explaining many elements of the world of Gile. In fact, since the point of the show is coming to accept things that we can never know, or accept the past and things out of our control, it's very fitting the series doesn't explain many of the mechanics here, and that many of the Haibane simply accept that. It would be a little hypocritical if the show said we need to accept the unchangeable nature of the past, and the fact that we will never know everything, and then said, okay, here's how this world works in extreme detail. It's very fitting that a show about our limited knowledge and inability to change the past doesn't explain everything, and shows that its characters are okay with that. Haibane Renmei is, though, still a very impactful series, and the amount of important lessons, statements, and advice given here is frankly astounding, especially considering it's only a 13-episode series. And yet it never comes off as preachy, and while most of its ideas aren't quite surface level, there is still a lot here, and it's great. These ideas are what I hold to be the main point of Haibane Renmei. While Rakka is usually a rather likable character, and it's great seeing her improve herself and learn to like herself and grow as a person, the main point of the series is to get us to improve ourselves and grow as a person and learn to like ourselves. It's here to help us get over personal stumbling blocks and accept loss in a healthy manner. Haibane Renmei is a treasure trove of great coming-of-age advice, and its portrayal of a young person learning to these is also a spot-on aspect of the series. While Rakka is a nice girl, she's by no means perfect, and her struggles with coming to terms with things and learning these lessons add a very intimate element to them. It's one thing for a series to say, oh, you should improve yourself, but it's another thing for a series to explore why that's important and detailing a character who struggles with doing so but ultimately manages to, proving that while we may struggle with these things, we can manage them. It's great seeing someone overcome their loss because it proves that we can as well. It also ties into the very warm nature of the series, as it feels like the series wants to nurture us. It doesn't want to simply tell us what to do, but it wants to help us achieve that. And I've seen a lot of stuff on this channel, and I've seen a lot of series in my day, and there are many series which are many times longer than HR, and yet don't hold a candle to the amount of things being said here. And I love it. I love Haibane Renmei, as it is one of the most morally impactful pieces, and yet, for as preachy as that sounds, it's never preachy. It just wants to help us come to terms with things, and to learn to accept ourselves. It's always a warm and welcoming piece, and it's always willing to put on a forgiving face, so that everyone involved can reflect on the past, and move in a brighter trajectory. I recognize that in the real world not everything will turn out great, and that there are things that are unfortunately unchangeable, and that not everyone will agree with or respect some of the morality expressed here. But it's nice seeing a world where everything is, and everything is okay. It really is the kind of thing to perhaps even rekindle some kind of faith in humanity. And I love its pure-hearted and hopeful approach to everything, to something which on the surface is extremely dark. Remember, this is a series about dead children, but it's a series about dead children learning to move past their pain and to grow in healthy ways and have nice interactions with others and to achieve some kind of redemption. It's a redemption story which doesn't frame itself as one, and yet shows that redemption is possible for many, if not all of us. It never really dwells on the sins of the past or one's own inadequacies. but instead on how to overcome these and validate one's own existence, on how to achieve redemption in the small actions we take with those all around us. And for this reason, it's such a lovely and warm and cozy, obscure anime memory. And this memory takes place in the very surreal setting of Gile. Gile? I don't know. I hope I'm pronouncing the name of the town right, because it's spelled Gile, but it's pronounced differently and I'm not really quite sure on how to pronounce it correctly. Anyways, this is the very mysterious walled city in which the Haibane live out the entirety of their lives, and eventually ascend out of. It's implied and even stated on occasion that Gile is a purgatory of sorts, and that everyone here, or at least all of the Haibane, have already died in some way, shape, or form somewhere else. It is a bizarre and isolated world full of the dead, full of mysteries, and full of seemingly incomprehensible mechanics. And yet it's also a rather pleasant, warm, and relaxed place, with a life of its own and a very welcoming community. While the enclosed nature of Gile and its plethora of unknown lore, phenomenon, and mechanics could have very easily lended a rather Lovecraftian element to the series, they don't. And that's because while the mystery is played up at times, it's never the central point of Haibane Renmei, and it never really impedes the Haibane from their true quest of cleansing their souls. If anything, its main purpose is teaching the viewer the importance of accepting things completely out of our control or understanding, and adapting to these developments instead of trying to have complete control over every aspect of our life, or run away from everything, or simply shut down at all times. The combination of such a mysterious and unexplained setting, with a cast that willingly acknowledges it, but also assigns it debatable importance, helps us ease into a rather alien world. One of the most impressive things about the setting craft of Haibane Renmei is how the locations of the series are obviously extremely alien, quaint, or bizarre when we think about them, but yet how they're also rather warm, welcoming, and genuinely relaxing. Yes, the town and all of its adjacent locations are in some kind of bizarre, isolated purgatory, something beyond our comprehension, but bizarre doesn't mean bad, and there is genuine warmth here from the people and the settings present. Everyone has very human lives, and we always feel welcomed into a world which may not seem that welcoming if we just look at the objective facts here. It often feels like somewhere just out of reach, like an old world that we can envision but can't quite ever reach. In fact, a lot of the locations and designs here even invoke some kind of fairy tale imagery. The town itself feels like a quaint fairy tale village, the mysterious forest full of intelligent animals is a staple of many fairy tales, and Old Home itself even resembles a castle of sorts. All of this is compounded by the very dreamlike nature of the series, and the fact that it seems very quaint. It's a setting that we can easily imagine, but one that we can also easily understand to be beyond this reality, something that isn't quite real. And this timeless element adds a sort of disconnect, letting us know that this is a very unique, magical, and fantastical place, but nowhere near enough of a disconnect to actually cause any kind of discomfort. The muted color palette also fits into this very well. HR uses a lot of earth tones, a lot of grays. If anything, the color palette often feels subdued or relaxed, something which is faded, but is still very welcoming, even if a little worn. And this even fits into the main characters of the show, as the Haibane are known as the charcoal wings or the gray wings, showing that yes, they are world weary or worn to some extent, but they're not bad, they're not malevolent. They're just beings simply waiting to be polished up into their final forms. Just how the settings here are something that, while seemingly cold, are just warm places that need a little polishing. The color palette does a good job subtly reinforcing this idea and enhancing the timeless element of HR's settings, as everything is usually bright enough to indicate continued use, continued life, and continued hope and progress, but worn and subdued enough to indicate that a great deal of time has passed, and that this is a setting beyond modernity, that it's beyond time itself. It lends a rather cozy element to a lot of the visuals present. And that leads me to taking a little bit of time to talk about these visuals and general shot composition cinematography here. I think the most unique thing I noticed here was that at times Haibane Renmei will kind of slip into a mixed medium format, where they will blend the digitally animated characters onto painted backgrounds, locations, and foregrounds, or at least switch up the animation of these elements so that they look painted, or more painted. This doesn't happen often, and I didn't notice it the first couple times it happened, but it does look really cool when it does happen and you do notice it. The characters stick out more so when you combine the digital animation of the characters upon some kind of painted surface, they really do stick out, and it really enhances the dreamlike element to any scene it's employed in because of how they stick out in such a subtly noticeable way. I know that's a little bit of an oxymoron, but if you see it, you'll understand. This is enhanced by the inconsistent application of the technique, as it happens so infrequently that you don't quite notice it when it does every time, although your brain does subconsciously, and this enhances the dreamlike element to the series itself. As for a majority of the animation, I also really like it. HR has the classic soft look of the early 2000s. It's not a style as detailed or angular as a lot of the 90s hand-drawn stuff, but it's still beautiful and ages well. And it's a great example of the art style which was prevalent in this time period of the early 2000s. The style is soft, and this works really well with a relaxed story and a grounded set of characters. The nature of the story and its interactions also mean that some creative cinematography had to be employed here as well. Now, as a series without a main antagonist and without a lot of action, Haibane Renmei could have very easily fallen into the trap of boring shot, reverse shot, conversation cinematography, where two characters talk and we just kind of switch between two shots of each character. However, there is enough movement here added through various means to prevent this from happening. Some of this movement is organic. We have some great scenes of the Haibane riding their bicycles, of running around, of just doing normal things. And these do happen enough to add a good deal of movement to the show and make it feel like these are living people. However, when dialogue is essential, and we do have to have about 2 or 3 minutes of talking at a time, there is some cinematography tricks employed to add a sort of artificial movement to some of the shots present. Hard cuts are actually less common than you would think in a series with this much dialogue, and instead there's a lot of dollying the camera and when zooming in and out at various points during conversations to add movement to certain shots, often at the beginning of a shot and sometimes at the end. Oftentimes the camera will make its way to the focus of the shot instead of just starting on it so that we can have some movement and not just a 4 or 5 second still. Stuff like this does a great job of adding a lot of dynamics to scenes that would otherwise be relatively stagnant, and when character movements wouldn't necessarily feel very natural. Stuff like this might feel a little out of place at times. It does feel like sometimes the cinematography is trying to be more exciting than what's actually happening on scene. It does clash a little with the tone of some of the scenes it's employed in, but I do appreciate the effort here, as it's still a lot better than the simple shot reverse shot format that might have been defaulted to. You don't want 5 minutes of shot reverse shot, especially in something like this, where lip syncing is not the strongest point of any animation. So I do credit them for attempting to give scenes like this some movement without drastically affecting what's actually happening in the scene. In addition, I want to say that it even adds a kind of low budget or amateur charm to this kind of thing, as while a dolly might be kind of expensive when making a live action movie, here it's probably cheaper to just move the camera a little than animating a bunch of new frames. So it is a creative and cheap way, I'm assuming, to get certain shots to be more dynamic when it's obvious that there wasn't necessarily that much to do. As an independently created piece, I think it's fitting that this does have some low budget charm to it, and it should be noted that this was something completed in about 6 months, so I wouldn't be surprised if the low budget charm is actual low budget charm. This was not something with the highest budget from what I can tell, and they do a very good job working with the budget they had though. It's a very charming world, and tying into this are the designs of the Haibane themselves. While the Haibane are certainly not human, as evidenced by their wings and halo, their designs are still human at their core, and simple enough to function very well here. There's no attempt to go for biblically accurate angels, and there's no attempt to look super heavenly. There's just regular people who wear regular clothes and just happen to have a pair of wings sticking out of their back. It's very grounded, and it allows the designs to feel very accessible, all the while being undeniably different. We don't have wings. It is in line with the show, though, that the design of the Haibane, these supernatural creations, is relatively muted and relaxed, and this fits in with the general settings of the series. I also appreciate the visual metaphor of the Haibane learning how to literally fly with wings that cannot really fly. It's something that marks the Haibane's complete growth, and it's fitting that they do literally earn their wings. Someone that doesn't have wings, though, are the many humans in the town of Gile. I didn't know really where to put this, but I do think it should be noted because they do add some unique elements to the series. So, if Gile is to function as a purgatory for the Haibane to fix themselves, is that also true for the humans here? If that is true, wouldn't they also be Haibane? Or does something in your actual life affect whether or not you become a human or a Haibane? It's not explained, and I understand that this isn't important. I just thought I would bring it up because it is kind of weird that there are normal humans here alongside the Haibane. They do live very harmoniously though, and they are very respectful of each other, so I'm glad that everyone still gets along in this life. And it is interesting that these people, whether they're in purgatory or not, still have their own lives and still have their own personalities and such. The original soundtrack of Haibane Renmei is the cherry on top of the beautiful atmosphere and spiritual setting though. Every song in this OST is beautiful and worthy of listen, and there are a few common traits which mesh together very well in giving the OST a very coherent feel. It feels like something in which every piece is crafted to fit a certain design ethos and works very well with the material it's assigned to. The OST makes abundant use of strings and vocals to invoke a heavenly or storybook feel. There's a very consistent effort to create a dreamlike, almost lullaby-like sound, and it's often very touching and on occasion even haunting. It's extremely relaxing to listen to, and it plays into the notions that if not some kind of heaven, this is some kind of realm beyond the physical and some kind of spiritual place. There is a soft, whimsical sound to almost every scene in the series, and it feels very inviting. Kao Otani, the guy that scored Gamera Guardian of the Universe, among other things, deserves a lot of credit here for molding an extremely unified vision, extremely fitting to the piece that it was made for. Even if you don't want to watch the series, this is one of those soundtracks I would recommend you listen to simply on its own because it's that good. The dubbing too is also good, although I'm not going to dwell on it here that much because honestly there's nothing super interesting here. It's just pretty good, competent dubbing, especially considering the era that it's from. There is some recognizable VA talent here though. Carrie Savage does the voice of Rakka, and you can tell it's Carrie Savage. She has a rather distinct voice. Michael McConaughey shows up, and he does the voice of the Communicator. I recognize that immediately, because he has a great voice. And there are smaller bit roles by well-known voice actresses Karen Strassman, and Wendy Lee, and Stephanie Sheh. Everyone does a good job here, although there's honestly not that much to really point out here. There is a lot to point out about the setting itself, though, and the brilliant OST which polishes it off so well. It is an extreme commitment to world building that pays off marvelously. It's something that embodies the show as a whole excellently, as it is a very weird, isolated, and metaphysical realm that we're in, but it's also a very comforting and welcoming one. One that lets us know that just because we don't know what's going on doesn't mean that it's the worst thing ever. It lets us know that, yes, people have died, but it's not the end of the world, and that redemption is still available to all of us. It's a wonderful setting that embodies the themes and ideas of the show more than it would seem on the surface. And it's a beautiful stage for this obscure anime memory. Anyways, since this series is on the shorter side, instead of doing the usual character theme format that I use for these longer form essays, we'll instead be looking at each important character alongside their connecting themes, and then have a quick overview of the tertiary cast and get into the conclusion. For the character component though, I'd like to start with a look at Ku, the youngest of the older wings and Rakka's initial superior. Although Ku doesn't have the most amount of screen presence, ascending of roughly halfway through the series, her lessons and her subsequent departure are critical elements for shaping not only Rakka, but also the plot of the series and how the morals of it are imparted to the viewer. When we first meet Ku in episode 1, along with the rest of the Haibane, she is established to be Rakka's superior in spite of her younger appearance. This is because Haibane are not born as babies, but at a arbitrary age, although they do seem to age normally past that point. What all of this means though is that she is essentially Rakka's mentor, or trainer, the one who is to ensure that Rakka develops well and learns the way of the world. Ku does this by being a generally positive and supportive presence in Rakka's life, and while Rakka probably spends more time with Reiki, it's obvious that Ku does have an important impact on Rakka, imparting some important life advice and generally lightening her mood. The two grow close, and once it's time for Ku to ascend, she subtly informs Rakka that it's her time to go, and that she's extremely appreciative for having met her. that she appreciates the time they've had together as it's helped both of them grow. A storm soon breaks out, and Ku departs for the last time, flying over the walls to the next phase of her life. Ku is the voice of hope above all. She is the voice of redemption, saying that while it may not seem possible, the Haibane will be able to fly one day. And it is as the voice of hope that she inspires Rakka to improve herself. And yet, as the voice of hope, her departure is very impactful, as it seems as though hope itself might be leaving. It's devastating that Ku leaves so suddenly, even if she does subtly inform and even thank Rakka. And while the impact of Ku's departure will be looked at more in Rakka's section, it's still important we look at how Ku is able to depart in the first place, and the positive messages that her character growth conveys to the viewer. Ku is the first of the Haibane to ascend because of her growth, and because of her hopeful nature. She has faith in being a good person, and faith in the process, and is rewarded for all of these things. It's also very fitting that as the youngest of the older wings, she's probably also the most innocent, and thus the one with the least to grow out of, and the one most receptive to the beauty of life. She hasn't had time to grow as cynical as some of the older members of the cast. While she is hyperactive at times, she is always well-intentioned and honest with her emotions, going as far to admit that she was jealous of Rakka being born older than her, although is now glad that that was the case. Ku proves that redemption is possible, and proves that a positive attitude will probably bring us closer to it than a sour one. It is important to realize that someone cannot be expected to be pleasant or positive at all times. We all have struggles, and we all have our emotions to deal with. It's perfectly reasonable to be upset from time to time. However, fixating on pain, loss, or negative emotions at all times is not reasonable. And one of the main ideas of Haibane Renmei is that fixating on these negative emotions can be just as destructive as the incidents that caused them in the first place. We see this in Reiki and Rakka, who fixate on past losses and this drags them down a bit. And in Ku, we see the inverse, that sometimes letting go of negativity and focusing on the positive are the best options. She is looked down on from time to time, and even thought to be a boy by her employer, a mistake she never corrects, and yet she never lets any of this get her down. In fact, she doesn't even really seem to be bothered by it or much in general. That's not to say that she's an idiot. She is aware of what's going on, and she does even have some kind of subtle wisdom to her. It's just that she understands that there is no point in getting upset over literally everything. Even when she is to ascend and sad that she will be separated from her friends, she accepts this and the unchangeable nature of it. Instead of focusing on her loss, focusing on how those around her have helped her grow and her gratitude towards all of them. She's grateful to them not only for being her friends, but also because she couldn't have gotten to this point without them, as their interactions have positively shaped Ku, just as Ku has positively shaped them. These many positive interactions have gone on to, quote, fill her soul, and are an assertion that nothing can be done alone, which is another interesting foil to Reiki, which will be explored later. Ku shows that it's important to have some kind of faith and trust in others, and that complete isolation or denial of one's feelings or denial of everyone is rather self-destructive. Had she isolated herself, she never would have been able to ascend or overcome any of her struggles, and she states this herself. However, she doesn't isolate herself and manages to help and support all of those around her, because she recognizes that mutual growth is often the most effective kind of growth. She rises to the occasion, and this leads to her actual rising, her flying over the walls, a reward for her honest heart and kind demeanor. The next Haibane we'll look at is Kanna. Now, Kanna is the tomboy of the group, and though not the most important character, still does offer a few insights here and there. In addition, her rather obvious character layers let us know that the Haibane of the world are still quite human, and this lays the groundwork for peeling back the layers of Reiki's more complex character. In terms of plot relevance, Kanna probably has the least objective importance, although her presence is still a nice one as she imparts lessons to the viewer, and her personality adds a new dynamic to many of her interactions. She is more sarcastic than the other Haibane, and something of a comic character here and there. For the most part though, she just hangs out around the house when not at work at the clock tower, although she does have various supporting impacts here and there. The most important aspect of Kanna's character is her stance that struggle, structure, and rules are essential for personal growth, as if everything was free, no one would learn to stand up on their own, and be all that they can be. Now there is a little room for criticism on how this is conveyed, It's more of a telling, not showing situation, but the advice itself is sound, and it should be noted that she does demonstrate these ideals to an extent when she is very open and blunt about overcoming Ku's departure, and that this departure does seem to result in a more grateful Kanna, more open to those around her. There does seem to be at least some application of these principles here, even if they do seem to be told more than showed. Kanna is a big believer in doing something, regardless of the possible hurdles to it. Whether it's fixing Old Home's clock tower or expressing herself, she's a free spirit and recognizes that being one requires a certain amount of strength and inner knowledge. She tells us that to live one's best life, they have to do some things themselves and get to know themselves and improve oneself. People wouldn't grow that much if there was zero pressure, and so Kanna respects and understands the need for a healthy amount of pressure to promote progress. If there was no struggle, change and growth would be much more rare, as they'd be much less incentivized. If there was no structure, any new growth would find it difficult to crystallize in the solid growth, and if there were no rules, growth could possibly delve into the malicious or be otherwise mismanaged. She says that she believes in all of these things, all the while demonstrating a rather flippant attitude, showing a deep layer of maturity under a rather carefree and nonchalant exterior. She is carefree enough to disregard some courtesies and schedules and basically do her own thing, but mature enough to generally live by her core principles and recognize the importance of rules, having herself gotten over the urge to climb over the walls that once plagued her. On the topic of character layers though, the two layers of Kanna, her flippant attitude and her inner wisdom, are among the first demonstrations to the viewer that the Haibane are just as complex as us, and not some kind of inhuman or perfect aliens. Kanna's layers are very obvious and very contrasting, even if they do exist in harmony, and noticing them tells the viewer to look out for layers in other Haibane. The payoff to this is that it makes Reiki's layers more obvious to the viewer once Rakka herself starts to notice them. Kanna is sarcastic, Reiki is cynical. Kanna is flippant, Reiki is borderline nihilistic at times. Although Kanna's character complexity doesn't extend much beyond this, the fact that there is obvious complexity here tells us to look out for it in other characters. Taking a break from the main Haibanes of the cast, it's time we now talk on the most intriguing and mysterious member of the core cast, the Communicator. Now, the Communicator is this unnamed figure who is essentially in charge of the Haibanes and oversees the administration of Haibane-related things. He is also one of the few to interact with those from beyond the walls and gives sound life advice. While he first seems to be a distant and cold Pharisee, it is revealed over time that the Communicator is simply a guy trying to help the Haibane under his charge. Even if some of his advice may seem a little harsh on the surface, it is always honest and always well-intentioned. While he himself is done growing by the time we meet him, he certainly grows on the viewer and proves a positive influence on Rakka and by extension, Reiki. The Communicator first shows up early on, when Rakka and Hikari venture to the temple for the first time, and also when the merchants from beyond the walls enter Gile for the first time. He is extremely formal in these initial appearances and casts an air of harsh authority, although this air is gradually dispersed after he rescues Rakka from the bottom of the forest well, even going as far as to give her his staff to help her walk. While he remains distant in these cases, it's important to note that he doesn't berate Rakka for her mistakes, but just instead offers very blunt, but effective, life advice to help her clear her mind and point her in the right direction. He does discipline her later as the head of the Haibane, and it's clear that he's a little disappointed. However, he has no real ill will towards Rakka, and it's obvious that the punishment here is to help her learn her lesson more so than to hurt her or put her down. When Rakka returns the staff that he lent her in the forest, he appoints her to clean the inside of the walls, granting her request to get beyond the walls to some weird extent when we think about it. And he talks to her about Reiki as well. The Communicator laments that Reiki hates his advice and refuses to grow, that she thinks that everything he says is some kind of arrogant nonsense, and that he fears that her refusal to listen to any of this wisdom may condemn her to live out the rest of her days in Gile, a fate that is said to happen to Haibane that don't ascend past a certain point in time, and a fate which is implied to have befallen the Communicator himself. To this end, he helps Rakka redeem Reiki by pointing her in the right directions, and he lives out the rest of his days striving to help all Haibane so they don't end up like him. I really like the Communicator, as he is very mysterious, but ultimately rather benevolent. He is a blunt, distant, and mysterious man, but also an ultimately well-intentioned, good, and caring one, and his distant nature adds an air of reverence to a character clearly paying for some kind of failure on his end. What this failure isn't clear, but the implication that he is a failed Haibane is definitely here, and this adds some tragic element to someone who seemed to initially just be a hostile paper pusher. I'd like to think that maybe he failed because of his distant nature, or maybe he didn't listen to the previous elder's advice. Maybe he sees a lot of himself in Reki, or maybe he simply just never grew close enough to anyone to really achieve his own redemption. He isn't bitter about any of this though, and instead seeks to help the other Haibane from suffering his fate, and he does this by communicating with them. Now, while the Communicator's title seems to originate from the fact that he is the only one that can communicate with those from beyond the wall, it's actually a twofold namesake, as he also communicates great truths to the Haibane. He warns on the circle of sin and often bluntly expresses issues to be overcome. He never shies away from holding a mirror up to those who need it, and he always wants to help by being as open as possible. He simply communicates what must be done. And this molds the Communicator into an isolated wise man, looking out for those under him, even if they may not like his guidance at all times. It even makes him into a sort of father figure for many of the Haibane, who he honestly just wants to advise as best as possible. He doesn't do this out of any attempt to belittle anyone, or prove his superiority, or out of any kind of bitterness, but to stir reflection, something which is essential to growth. Growth that he hopes all the Haibane can accomplish, seeing as that he could not. Returning to the main Haibane of the cast, I want to take a quick minute to talk about Nemu. As the oldest member of the cast, Nemu is the calmest and arguably most mature, being very steady-minded, and she lends a calming presence to whatever scenes she happens to be in. She doesn't necessarily do that much, her character is a little passive, but beyond this, her character does serve two important purposes. In the literal context of the story, her position of being Reki's longest-term friend helps us get some insights in the Reki, and also proves that reconciliation between people is possible, seeing as that the two did not get along for a very long time, and proves that relationships do evolve over time. Secondly, in her job as a librarian, Nemu opens up a conversation about what God is, and God's possible role in the universe of Haibane Renmei. Like most of the supporting cast, Nemu does not do much in terms of a material sense. However, Nemu's presence is still a very nice element of the show, and her episodes at the library do serve to directly open up a conversation about God, as she wants to help finish rewriting a book that was lost to time to give to the head librarian, whom she seems to view as something of a mother. Later on, as Reki's mental situation starts to fray in the winter, Nemu proves herself a kind and understanding friend, easing Reki through these times. She does this in a variety of ways, and often is the only one that can truly read the room, or at least truly read Reki, allowing her to support Reki when she needs it, or to give Reki the space she needs when she needs space. Now, getting to the conversation on God, while Nemu doesn't speculate too much on God or the presence of God during the episode in which they kind of rewrite the story of creation, her bringing up this topic does allow HR to delve into its thought on the divine. While Haibane Renmei doesn't do anything to define God, the conversation here definitely seems to support the idea of something, and this is a subtly prevalent thread throughout the entirety of the series. There is a spiritual nature to everything here, whether it's the ascension of the Haibane, the implication of seemingly esoteric riddles, a few mentions of God here and there, as well as some religious imagery. There is enough to convince me that this is a spiritual realm, and that it does have spiritual overtones. However, while this adds to an esoteric construct of a higher being, Haibane Renmei clearly goes out of the way to leave details up to interpretation. This, of course, is by design, as Haibane Renmei doesn't really want to tell you about a specific interpretation of God, so much as to say that there is a higher power, and that living a good life and improving yourself will bring you closer to it, something which is ultimately for your own good and the good of those around you. Although the in-universe story of creation is a myth created by Nemu and Rakka, it, and by extension the program, portray a benevolent and loving creator. It may seem odd how a show with such overtly spiritual elements and ideas doesn't directly touch on religion other than this assertion of an undefined God creator. It does make sense though on both an in-universe and meta level. In-universe, it means that the Haibane have to come to their own organic growth as opposed to deriving it from any kind of organized religious body or doctrine. It is important to note that while this is a spiritual show, there isn't any overtly religious groups or organization present. I know there is the Haibane Temple, but what is actually happening at that temple isn't really described. It just seems to be an important place. And this is important in a meta context because it leaves up the interpretation of God to the viewer, which makes this a much more accessible show. In addition, the fact that God is present here to some extent, but is never really defined or dwelled on, adds to the mysterious atmosphere, as there is something beyond everyone's comprehension, including the viewer, that is not really defined, but does seem to have power in this universe. Overall, the religious and spiritual stuff is handled in a rather esoteric and mysterious way, although I have no problem with this as it is more accessible to a wider range of viewers, and it does allow the characters in-universe to come to their own conclusions more organically. I mean, there are rules here in this universe, but it's obviously a much more esoteric interpretation of religion and God, although it is one which does seem to define a loving God that loves all of God's creations, but also wants to watch them learn to stand on their own 2 feet. Getting back to Nemu herself, Nemu is the most layered of the supporting Haibane. She is calm, compassionate, and hardworking, in spite of literally sleeping in her sleep. These surface layers are just developments, though, which hide a rather turbulent past. As Reki's only real childhood friend, although calling her that for the entirety of their childhood is a bit of a stretch, Nemu is aware of Reki's inner darkness, and that some of that darkness might potentially originate from Nemu's own actions. As in their earlier days, Nemu herself directed a lot of acrimony towards Reki for being sin-bound. This is important because it means you can't just hate someone because they are flawed, especially if it's something which is not entirely within their control. Everyone is flawed, to some extent, and it's better to address this in a constructive manner instead of just pointing at someone and condemning them because they're not perfect. Nemu internalizes this lesson from her poor treatment of a young Reki and the subsequent guilt she feels over this. Over time, though, the two grew closer and reconciled, as Nemu learned that being sin-bound wasn't something Reki so much chose as something that happened, and the two even become real best friends. This means that Nemu has insight into Reki that no one else has, at least until Rakka figures everything out. It also means that Nemu feels a certain level of guilt and compassion for Reki. And while this isn't something that's really dwelled on throughout the series, it does add a very interesting subtext to Nemu's character and actions. Nemu is very aware that in their youth, she was quite rude to Reki at times, and she was also aware that Reki is someone that was and is still struggling with loneliness. So there is a real question, at least in the back of Nemu's mind, of how much of Reki's current issues derive from Nemu's poor treatment. Now, to be honest, I don't think a lot of it did, considering that the two are reconciled by this point and they are very supporting of each other. However, in Nemu's mind at least, she does seem to have some guilt for Reki's current state. In fact, this might even be why Nemu hasn't ascended yet either, as the communicator straight up says that Reki's troubles and failure to depart are the reason that Nemu stays behind, because she's concerned about Reki. While this does add some logistical issues, seeing as that Reki's time is running out but Nemu seems to be fine, this is an esoteric world and we're not going to dwell on that. I mean, there's probably some in-universe reason for that that's just not explained. That's not really an issue. I just think that this is all a very interesting component to Nemu's character because it does show that she's compassionate for Reki, although if you really wanted to, you could also argue that there is a degree of selfishness here. Perhaps Nemu is worried that if she ruined Reki's life, she will never be able to fix her own. This is probably not the case, but I could see an argument for this being made. The two are genuinely friendly though, so I don't really think that Nemu has any guilt left here, even if she does feel guilt, and even if that guilt might be getting in the way of her own progress. This reconciliation though does prove that personal reconciliation is very possible. And I specify personal reconciliation because while the whole goal of Haibane Renmei seems to be to reconcile with one's past, one's own losses, one's own self, and God, reconciling with other people is often an important part of that. Nemu and Reki go from almost complete acrimony to begrudging tolerance to rock-solid support. And this shows that it's possible to forgive someone and even befriend them because people change over time. And while the change can be scary, growth is also a form of change, and therefore some change is good. I'm very confident that Nemu and Reki are glad that they went from hating each other to being friends. And this relationship is a great example that it is possible and it can be something which lasts. Because while Reki forgiving people and getting over things in the last couple episodes is very nice, that kind of happens over the course of maybe a few weeks, maybe a month tops. You could make the argument that, well, it's just a period of détente or something. However, the fact that Reki and Nemu have been friends for years at this point proves that no, it is genuinely possible to genuinely fix relationships and build healthy ones where unhealthy ones once existed. Reki too benefits from befriending and caring for others. And this clunky segue gets us into her segment. Now Reki is the most important of the supporting Haibane, and the subject of the last few episodes as Rakka goes from focusing on herself to focusing on others. Reki is probably the most complex of any of the characters here, as she is both rather cynical and jaded, and yet genuinely caring and vulnerable. As Rakka's older sister/mother figure, Reki does a lot to help Rakka grow, and this ultimately pays off when Rakka is the one who finally gets Reki to open up and accept others into her heart. This finally allows her to ascend and accept her loss and accept things as she moves on to the next stage of being a Haibane. Now plot-wise, Reki has two arcs. The first arc sees Reki as the main supporting character, caring for and advising Rakka through this odd new world that she has found herself in. She is the pseudo-leader of the main Haibanes which we follow, and always sees to it that everyone gets any kind of help they might need. She goes out of her way many times to do many things for many of the Haibane, especially Rakka, and even though she comes off as cynical and jaded, she's always reliable and supportive. Here we see that Reki is dependable, knowledgeable, and deeply caring to all those around her, and this endears her to the viewer once her second arc begins. When Rakka gets over her own issues and starts working at the temple, the communicator asks her to help Reki, who is running out of time to ascend, and this kicks off Reki's second arc, which shows her dealing with her own issues of self-loathing and her pained emotional side. As the subject of this arc, though, she is the recipient of Rakka's efforts to try and help her move through these struggles. Slowly but surely, Reki, with the support of those around her, reconciles with Hyoko, whom she almost got killed, and Midori, who was kind of bitter about the previous point. And she even eventually reconciles with herself. This final act is only possible, though, with Rakka's help, as Rakka is the one to pull Reki from the tracks, a possible allusion to a possible tragic fate in the real world, and finally help her overcome her inner loneliness by welcoming others into her heart again. This final act allows Reki to be at peace at last and ascend as the other Haibane smile happy, knowing that Reki, the one who helped them so much, finally got the help that she needed. Now looking at Reki's character and themes, it's important we establish what her character layers are, why they are that way, and what her redemption is trying to get across to us viewers. Starting with Reki's character, Reki has two different layers to her character. The calm, cynical, but ultimately loving and strong one that she wears around others and early on in the series, and the scared, lonely, frightened, self-loathing young woman that we see she kept repressed inside when she's truly alone, or when she feels alone, and we see more of this in her second arc later in the series. When around others, and indeed for a majority of her screen presence, Reki is an older sister, helping everyone out and serving as an important support for everyone around her. She feeds, advises, and nurtures all of the other Haibane, and this massive responsibility requires her to be strong enough to bear this weight, which she does very well. This is a brittle strength, however, as while Reki does do a lot for others, she neglects herself and is hesitant to fully embrace others. And this starts to get into her pained side. While Reki does love those around her, she's not really that good of accepting others' love, as she struggles to love herself. And this stems from her loneliness and low self-esteem. She's learned how to function more so than how to live. That's not to say she doesn't have fun or anything, but simply to point out that there is a great amount of inner darkness within Reki that she's never been able to fully get over. And I do like how Reki's first appearances and arc tend to focus on her outer layer, although her inner darkness is still evident from her cynical nature and the fact that she smokes, and her later appearances and arc focus on her inner layer. All of this darkness, of course, originates from a deep-seated sense of loneliness that she's always struggled with, which in turn, to some extent, seems to stem from an unpleasant childhood and her low self-esteem. From her very entry into the world, Reki had been recognized as sin-bound, that is, she had black wings, and this has weighed heavily on her. Not only did her black wings mean that she was often ostracized at a young age, but also that she grew to see isolation as natural. She grew to see her being looked down upon as natural, and in turn started to look down upon herself. All of this means that she wasn't really able to form many strong bonds as a child. In fact, her only real bond was with Koromori. However, Koromori departed Reki, as all Haibane must at some point, at a relatively young age, and this and her strong attachment to Koromori made this ascension extremely painful for Reki. Reki had put all her eggs in this metaphorical basket, so when it left, she felt as though she truly had nothing. This, of course, was extremely painful, and so out of self-defense, Reki concludes simply to never grow close to anyone again. This doesn't actually address the cause of the pain, though, which is her own loneliness and low self-esteem. Instead, all this really does is allow the two to fester and create the narrative that Reki must deserve this pain for some reason. Reki creates this narrative within her own headspace, as then at least things sort of kind of make sense because she's constructing a reason for them to make sense. She does this to try and shield herself from the sometimes arbitrary nature of the world. She reasons that she must be unworthy because she doesn't want to accept the fact that there are simply things out of our control sometimes. She fears that she will never ascend because she, in her own eyes, is unworthy. This in turn leads her to reason that if this is the case, she will be forever alone, as all the other Haibane will ascend at some point while she is stuck down here. Reasoning that she will therefore be stuck in Gile, she guards her heart and refuses to open up emotionally, not wanting to get too close to anyone, lest their departure sting more than it needs to. Reki's biggest fear is loneliness, and this fear fuels the self-loathing and isolated tendencies, which in turn motivate her distant nature. Now, she is very friendly and very supportive because she doesn't want others to experience her pain. However, out of a fear of this pain, she instinctually withdraws herself past a certain point. She doesn't want to form relationships closer than a certain threshold because she knows that when they end, it will hurt her tremendously. Or at least she thinks it will, and she's scared of that. And her lack of close relationships means that Reki has semi-intentionally cut herself off from an adequate level of emotional support to get over her own inner issues, and is thus trapped in the so-called cycle of sin. Now, it is important to note here that oftentimes in Haibane Renmei, the word sin can be interpreted as darkness, and when we do this, it makes understanding some of these points more accessible. For example, it sounds very harsh if we say Reki is consumed by the sin of loneliness, but it makes perfect sense if we say she is consumed by the darkness of loneliness. I simply state this because Haibane Renmei is a very hopeful and forgiving piece. It's not some kind of Puritan crusade, and I don't want it to sound like it is. Anyways, Reki fears loss, so she can't connect with others, and thus has no one to help her through her own fears, which include a fear of loss, which means she cannot connect with others, so on and so forth. While loneliness and regret are things that we will all experience at some point for some amount of time, Haibane Renmei states that there needs to be a distinction between experiencing these things and wallowing in them. In one of its most stark messages to the audience, the tale of Reki informs the viewer that atonement is not wallowing, and one cannot obsess over sin or darkness if they hope to move forward in their life. It's important to recognize such things, but fixating on them completely is destructive. And the communicator succinctly states this with the riddle, to recognize one's sin is to have no sin. Now remember, depending on the context of the scene, sin can be interpreted as darkness, and what Reki ultimately learns is that to recognize one's own darkness is to have no darkness. That's not to say that acknowledging the past is some kind of atonement or will fix everything instantly, but to propose the idea that the recognition in and of itself is not a bad act. In fact, this recognition is essential, as otherwise whatever is weighing on you will do so until you talk about it with others or try to confront it in some other kind of healthy, constructive manner. If one wants to move on from whatever weighs on them, then they first must acknowledge its existence. That is to say, if one wants to have no inner darkness, they must first acknowledge it. And Reki refuses to acknowledge it because that could open up some painful wounds for her. Instead, she suffers from burying her head in the sand for so long that these issues compound over time. It's why she dislikes the communicator's words, after all, as they're pretty blunt reflections of things that she doesn't want to look upon. And it's why she's only able to ascend once she's finally able to accept these reflections and reach out to someone, in this case, Rakka. And it is nice that Rakka does help Reki break through this cycle by easing her through the process of reconciling with Hyoko and Midori and learning to trust others. This allows Reki to see firsthand that she hasn't ruined anyone's life and that life goes on, so she shouldn't badger herself constantly as if she did ruin someone's life. In fact, she has done nothing but improve the lives of many more people. Although Reiki doesn't fully open up until the last episode, the only reason that she has the opportunity to do so at all is because of all she's done for Rakka, which proves that Reiki's actions for others have had positive impacts, even for herself, and even if she doesn't want to acknowledge these positive impacts. Now, it might seem weird that someone wouldn't want to acknowledge their positive impacts on others or the world around them, but this again stems back to Reiki's self-loathing. She believes that she's unworthy of any kind of praise or support, and therefore doesn't want to take the credit for any of her positive actions, therefore depriving herself of a lot of self-esteem that could be derived from taking pride in something healthy and constructive, something that someone should take pride in, because she's simply afraid of getting her head out of the sand. Opening up isn't easy, and the fear that it will result in getting hurt again is something which propels the cycle forward. It's why Reiki goes out of her way to even try and sabotage the opening up process. It's why she doesn't want to acknowledge her own positive impacts on the world. And this is not out of some kind of ill will, but out of a drastic escalation in ignoring the problems which stem from her own fears. While Reiki is not happy with the current state of affairs, she's also rather used to them, and it's often very difficult for someone to leave what they're so used to for something which they're not used to, and something which, at least in their minds, is not guaranteed to work. And this can even lead to self-sabotage in an attempt to maintain the status quo, as we see when Reiki argues that she only helped Rakka out of some kind of cynical ploy to get on the god's good side. She claims that she only helped Rakka in order to ascend, and so she kind of claims that helping Rakka was a selfish deed. I don't really think that this is the case. I just think that she's putting herself down because she's afraid to or unwilling to acknowledge any of her positive impacts on the world. She is so lost in her self-doubt that she completely dismisses her own very well-established empathy and calls herself a manipulative liar and nothing more. While Rakka is bothered by this statement, she sees through it though and tells Reiki to not only stop lying to her, but to herself. Oftentimes when we hear someone say, "Stop lying to yourself," we think of someone being told to stop deluding themselves, to stop hyping themselves up more than they should, to level their arrogance, so to speak. However, it's also important in contexts like this, as it's important to tell someone that they do need to acknowledge themselves and that they are worthy of respect, because Reiki is someone that is constantly lying to herself to some extent. However, it's not in a way that we're used to. She tells herself that she has no positive impacts. She tells herself that she's unworthy. She tells herself that she's useless. However, her actions and empathy prove the exact opposite of all of these, and Rakka is the one that finally gets her to accept this truth, to accept the idea that she does have self-worth and is valid, to finally accept a helping hand and realizing that there's nothing wrong with doing so. While it may be scary, it is necessary from time to time, and refusing it when you really need it is almost always a bad idea. You need to balance self-improvement with a reasonable amount of depending on and trusting others. And you cannot live a good life if you cannot accept some kind of loss, and if you format your life specifically around avoiding any potential loss. And this is what Reiki learns as she learns to love herself and learns to let others into her heart, because even though she won't have them forever, or it seems like she won't have them forever, having them now and cherishing them while she can is still a much better option than living in some kind of sad state of constant self-denial and self-loathing. One cannot live life without others, and while losing them does speak to the impermanent nature of the world, loss is something tragic that we almost get over, loss is also inevitable, and so to some extent, we need to accept it, as refusing to do so can only lead to bad things, like isolating oneself from all potential meaningful relationships. And this is something that Reiki learns as she learns to finally embrace her meaningful relationships with others. It is an interesting discussion, though, drawing the line between where Reiki's interest in helping others stems from, how much of it is a genuine desire to help, and how much of it is a sort of cynical ploy to try and buy herself redemption. I'm thoroughly on the side that Reiki only said that she was helping Rakka for her own selfish needs because she didn't want to change. I don't actually think that Reiki had some kind of constructed conspiracy to quote-unquote use all of the other Haibane to prove herself worthy of redemption. I just think that she was scared to accept herself and her self-worth, because it is proven throughout the series that she does have a lot of real empathy, because she doesn't want anyone to go through or experience any of the pain she has. She specifically tells this to Rakka, saying, don't make the mistakes I have made so you don't have the pain that I have. And this does prove a lot of empathy on Reki's part, and it does prove that she is a good person, and that all of the actions here are not simply just some scheme. The idea that she does anything for others out of some kind of cynical calculation only really comes up when Reki herself states so in the last episode, in a state of obvious emotional disturbance and in a state of full-on self-loathing. You could also argue that it briefly shows up in a diary entry where she hints that she might only want to help Rakka to prove herself. I don't really see that as proof of some kind of gross, cynical, manipulative construction, especially when she proves herself to be an honest and deeply caring person throughout the entirety of the series, aside from a line set out of extreme emotional duress and a possibly misinterpreted line in a journal. Her actions and advice simply can't have me buy the idea that she is a master manipulator, or that she's anything other than a genuinely caring person who's simply working their way through their inner darkness, and thankfully succeeds in doing so. Now, supposing that Reki was some kind of master manipulator though, which again I thoroughly disbelieve, this idea does lend itself to an interesting point of the series, and that idea is that if someone does the right thing for the wrong reason, the right thing is still being done, and could potentially stir growth and some kind of enlightenment. This answer is of course subjective, but the series does directly state this via a narration provided by the communicator, who states that while Reki's motivations were initially cynical, seeking only to help herself by helping others, doing so for so long warmed her heart to the point where she did the right thing out of genuine compassion, and this is what actually redeemed her. She wasn't necessarily redeemed because of what she did, as proven by the fact that doing the right thing for the wrong reason didn't really free her, but by the spiritual growth that came from learning the correct motivations. It wasn't so much what she did, but the fact that doing what she did taught her what her motivations should really be. And you could argue that, well, she's only saved because of what Rakka does and Rakka's assistance. However, it's important to note that the only reason Rakka is able to assist Reki in the first place is because Reki did the right thing and helped Rakka through all of her struggles. So you could argue that this idea does have some credence throughout the show, although again, how much it does is subjective. It does provide an interesting through line with some of the religious ideas present here though, because realigning her motivations is a sort of show of faith in doing the right things on Reki's part. She no longer cares for others because she wants the get in the heaven card, but because she knows that it's what she should be doing, because it's the right and just thing to do. She has faith in this system now, if you will, and thus it can be argued that she is saved by this faith. Finally, we get to Rakka, the main protagonist of Haibane Renmei, and the main Haibane that evolves throughout most of the series. She's a great protagonist, and her journey of acceptance is one that teaches some of the most important and noteworthy ideas and lessons of Haibane Renmei to us, the viewer. While she isn't perfect when we first meet her, that's kind of the point, and an essential part of her characterization as her self-improvement and coming to terms with her current state is what displays the important messages of Haibane Renmei to us, the viewer. Getting to the plot overview, Rakka is introduced in her cocoon dream in episode 1, where, while falling, a crow tries to stop her descent, although she accepts that it cannot and that she will fall. Once she wakes from this dream, she emerges from her cocoon and is readily accepted by the Haibane of Oldhome, especially Reki, who becomes a sort of surrogate mother to her and does a lot to help her adapt to her new life. She also grows close to Ku, her initial superior. Initially, Rakka is rather upset, as anyone in a completely alien surrounding with no memory would be. But she slowly grows closer to her new friends and works to start establishing her place in this new world. Some progress is made, but a setback is experienced when Ku ascends, leaving Rakka feeling heartbroken. She starts to grow directionless, restless, and dreary. And in an attempt to alleviate her pain, she seeks answers for where Ku went, and perhaps even how to go there. She doesn't find these answers, of course, and her inner pain becomes a darkness that turns her wings black. Panicked that she might now be sin-bound, Rakka goes as far as to start cutting her feathers and wandering off into the forest. Eventually this leads to her, after being guided by one of the crows, to a well, which she falls down. While she is trapped inside of this well, she comes across the remains of the crow from her dreams, and buries it out of respect. It should be noted here that this crow had been seeking her out specifically for the entirety of her time in Oldhome in order to forgive her for some past undisclosed transgression. Now, this is not said by the crow, and this is not literally shown, and it's not really clear how the mechanics work here, because I'm pretty sure the crow was not a crow in the past life, but someone seeking to forgive Rakka. But seeing as this show is a big metaphor, I have no issue with the literal logistic issues here. Anyways, this crow sought Rakka, and now she has finally understood its message and received its forgiveness. This encounter teaches her that the dead do not want the living to mourn for them constantly, and that we must all eventually move on. She buries the crow and then is rescued from the well and given some advice by the communicator. This, and her previous epiphany, helps her move on with her life, and she even gets a job in the Haibane temple. Here, the communicator asks her to help Reiki open her heart so that she can ascend before her time runs out. Rakka does this, and her actions set a lot of the groundwork in helping Reiki eventually learn to love herself and others, the lesson she needed to ascend. At the series' conclusion, Rakka has kind of taken Reiki's place as an important member of Old Home, and one which seems to have some kind of motherly role for the younger Haibane. In the last scene, she happily announces the arrival of twins. Since Haibane Renmei is a show which focuses more on its themes than plot and characters, even though these are still great, the most important aspect of Rakka, her struggles, and evolution are the messages which they convey to the viewer. However, it would be a great disservice to say that that's all Rakka does, as she herself is a great character, and it would be unjust to ignore this and her development. Rakka is a very unique protagonist for a very unique story. She doesn't have any super unnatural powers, and none of the Haibane do, they're basically just people with wings. And since Haibane Renmei doesn't have an antagonist, she doesn't have any physical fights or anything like that either. However, she does have the power of empathy and humanity, which hopefully all of us do possess to some extent, and she eventually learns to harness this power in order to prevail against her inner conflicts. While Haibane Renmei doesn't have an antagonist or fights, it does have conflict. It's just that most of that conflict is inner conflicts, which the cast must overcome via their own evolution and development. And for this kind of struggle, Rakka is a near-perfect protagonist. She's very kind and likable, enough so for us to see that she is a good person at her core and has great potential, and we can support her. But she's also very flawed and emotional, and this helps us to relate to her, and it makes all of the lessons she learns more accessible. They're more accessible because this isn't some perfect heavenly being preaching them to us. Instead, it's a very flawed young girl learning these important lessons and showing us that how much they help her, and that if she can do it, so can we, and we can benefit from these lessons as well. It feels like there's real stakes here, and it feels like there's real character growth here, even if there might not be any material stakes. As the story progresses, Rakka learns many of the important lessons that she needs, and eventually becomes a much more mindful person. I really like how mundane the entirety of Haibane Renmei's cast are, because the absence of any kind of magical, or physical, or unrealistic powers means that everyone here is almost a completely baseline human, with the exception of wings and a halo, which are mostly cosmetic. It makes it obvious to us that the lessons here are ones that anyone can learn and embrace and execute, and that if we do, they are extremely beneficial, because there's no special powers that are needed to embrace these things and to live them out in your own life. It really does bring the series home and grounds what is on the surface a very fantastical and bizarre story. It makes the morals extremely accessible, and it makes them more endearing. Zooming in more on Rakka, it's very fulfilling seeing her personal evolution. Her characterization always feels fitting and relatable. As her character is kind of an examination of the grief cycle, it does a very good job walking a line between grieving enough to get us to empathize, but not wallowing to the point of being detrimental to the viewing experience. We've all seen shows where characters wallow in gloom to the point of unlikability, but Rakka never gets there. She does wallow in it at points, but she still tries to live her daily life, and her actions and character development are done in a very grounded way so that she's always relatable. We just want to see her succeed. And thankfully she does, as she gains insight into the human condition and in turn becomes a rock for others. The Rakka we get in the latter half of the series is very different from the scared and nervous one we first meet, and yet it's undeniably the same person, just a better form of her. She finds redemption not only in her own epiphanies, but helping others reach them as well. She's a beating heart of the series, and an inspiring one at that. Rakka is a vessel for many of Haibane Renmei's most important ideas, because many of Rakka's literal struggles can be interpreted as metaphors for struggles which one can have when facing loss or grief. Her literal struggle to adapt to the town of Gile is a metaphor for learning to live in the new context brought upon by a possible loss of a loved one. Her literal struggle with being sin-bound is a metaphor for dealing with the inner darkness inside of it, and even manifests a literal commentary on the tragedy of self-harm. Her literal struggle to get out of the well can be seen as a metaphor for the struggle of getting out of the pain of loss, of grieving. And all of these applications of Rakka are both subtle enough to give meaning to the literal context of the show, it doesn't distract from what's actually happening on screen, as we're still concerned about her living in Gile, her healing her wings, and her getting out of the well, but the subtext is obvious enough to the point where the messages are also pretty apparent here after minimal thought. The fine line between too obtuse and too on the nose is walked perfectly here, and it's great writing that both a literal and metaphorical interpretation are still very meaningful to the viewer at the same time. Rakka and her story are great, but so are all the metaphors attached to them, and it is a triumph of writing that both sides of the story are equally appealing. So let's get into the literal events, their metaphorical interpretations, and how the marriage of literal and metaphorical makes the ideas she displays so accessible, and Haibane Renmei a masterpiece. Now, going in chronological order, Rakka's first struggle is simply learning the ways of Gile and establishing a new role in this very alien setting. She has no idea what's really happening around her, and while surrounded by friendly faces, still feels very alone and out of place at times. She tries her best and puts on a brave face, yet a longing for the past, answers, and a general unease can and do overwhelm her at times and cause her a great deal of pain. She is making progress, yes, but the pain inside of her is still rather evident for all to see, and everyone around her, while sympathetic, is not her, and she's not opened up enough to anyone for them to really understand all of the intricate details of this. And this kind of relates to the pain that one might go through after any kind of big life-changing circumstance, whether it be the loss of a loved one or even simply moving somewhere else. Getting over the initial shock to the system a brand new set of circumstances and contexts can bring can be a very difficult and lonely experience. Losing someone you cherish will of course be painful. Having to live without their support that you were once fond of and perhaps even dependent on, is a radical new context that one has to frame their life in once it arrives. And this is how it can be seen as a metaphor. Rakka is in a new literal context, trying to pick up and make up whatever pieces she can, while one going through a loss or some kind of emotional struggle is in a new emotional context, living without someone that was close to them, or living without something that they're familiar with, or living in completely new scenarios. In both examples, though, the experiences of adapting to the new context around someone can be extremely taxing and isolating, even if they are surrounded by supportive people. The path is also a very long one, and I bring this up to appreciate how the pacing of Haibane Renmei lets us take a realistic amount of time to move on. Things are not just better overnight. Things take time to get better, and in fact sometimes they get worse before they get better. There is no magic anime solution here. She just has an epiphany that we'll get to later. However, before that, it's important to remember that the pain of loss can impair one's judgment and lead to improper or even dangerous decisions as one struggles to either reason with their loss or reconcile with it, or both. In Haibane Renmei, this is Rakka's wings literally turning black as the darkness inside her, darkness stemming from Ku's departure, fills her soul and she starts to physically lash out at her wings, cutting away at any black feathers. There's two layers to this metaphor. There's the top layer, which is her wings just turning black, and this is a very literal example of how emotional pain can consume someone. And in both a literal and physical sense, the onset of overwhelming gloom can be something which can hold us down pretty hard, and can also lead to some pretty poor decisions. Rakka's search for literal answers on Ku's location, i.e., she literally looks for her, can mirror the pain that one has for someone who's passed. In the real world, you're not literally searching for them, you know they're gone. But everyone's still going to want answers to some extent, or to say something that they never got to say. So whether it be questions about how one passed, why one did, or what one didn't get to say to them, there are going to be things that gnaw at you or others when they go through loss. And it's a simple fact of the world that these questions may never be answered, or you may never get to say that thing to that person, and it's just an unfortunate set of circumstances you can't change. Just like how Rakka cannot simply bring Ku back, or just simply go join Ku overnight. Neither Rakka nor we will get all of the answers we crave, and both she and us must learn to accept this, and we must learn to live our lives in spite of this lack of complete closure. And Rakka does, and so can we. It's not always the easiest path though, and it is often fraught with challenges from both outside and within. And this gets to the second level of this wings metaphor, and the most dark and on the nose, and yet most critical, open, and honest metaphors of Haibane Renmei, which is a surprisingly realistic exploration on the tragedy of self-hurting. As mentioned earlier, Rakka's wings turn black, and ashamed of this and her struggle to move on, and other personal elements, she cuts these feathers off. Now, in universe, this seems relatively painless. There's no blood, and it doesn't really seem to affect her like that much physically, but the metaphor is obvious, as she's literally cutting a part of herself. This is a talk about self-harm. And I understand that this is a very grim topic, and one that might be very sensitive, but I appreciate that Haibane Renmei doesn't pull any punches when it comes to having this conversation. Other than the fact that there is no blood, because I assume that they want us to focus on the emotional pain and not the physical pain. The conversation itself, though, is a very mature one, and it's surprising how well this show does, opening up a conversation about a very dark and personal topic that is unfortunately more common than we'd like to think. I have immense amounts of respect for Haibane Renmei, not only for bringing this up at all, but also handling it so respectfully. While the clipping of wings does not involve blood, it still has a literal physical impact on Rakka's body, and I think this is a way of making it more accessible to audiences. I think why they do this is, A, they want the show to continue being pretty clean, but also they don't want us focusing on blood or anything. They want us focusing on the emotional pain that would lead to bloodletting, and how that pain, if it gets too out of hand, can lead to more unfortunate circumstances. We see this in how it's handled. Rakka's ashamed of the fact that she clips her wings, and the fact that she goes out of her way to hide it is also chillingly realistic. She knows that she shouldn't be doing this, but she's just so emotionally weary and pained that she does feel bad about her actions, and she can't help herself to some extent. It's such a clear window into such a deep, dark despair that she struggles with. She clips her wings because she's so emotionally distraught that refraining from doing so is something she has an immense amount of struggle with. And while the act is a literal attempt to expel or cut away sin from herself and Haibane Renmei, as she cuts away her tainted feathers, it's a very obvious stand-in for the tragedy that we might see in the real world. And it's disturbing when we see it on screen, and when we think about it. And yet, it's a tragedy we can't afford to ignore, and Haibane Renmei wants us to realize that. In HR, and often in the real world, there are supportive people around whoever is in this much pain, and the pain person does, to some extent, logically understand that they shouldn't be doing this, and that people do, to some extent, care. And yet their anguish overwhelms them, and those around them are intentionally left in the dark, or even misled by them. And it's not out of some kind of malice or spite, but out of just overwhelming pain, and struggling to deal with it. And it's chillingly real in Haibane Renmei. However, the chilling realism of this look at self-injury is taken to the logical extreme by HR's somewhat subtle analysis of the final extreme of this, and that is self-termination. I have to use certain terms because, YouTube. Anyways, this is a subtle commentary, but it's definitely woven throughout the show, and it's most prevalent in the Haibane's cocoon dreams and their naming conventions. Now, the names of the young feathers are all based upon their aspirations, and the names of the older feathers upon their cocoon dream. The youth name themselves after their hopes, because they struggle to remember their cocoon dreams. Meanwhile, the older feathers remember them more vividly, and so take their name from them. HR makes it clear that most of the Haibane are dead humans, although how they died is not really explored until later on, mostly in Reki's case, but also to some extent Rakka's as well. Now, Reiki is said to have, quote, laid upon the tracks and been torn asunder, something which is heavily implied to have been rather intentional, even almost recreating this in the final episode. It's implied that she, and to some extent Rakka, decided to wrap things up themselves because they felt too alone and like no one would care. Using this logic, and the fact that this is the subject of her cocoon dream, we can then reason that every cocoon dream is telling of how each Haibane passed, and some of these could possibly even reflect common forms of self-termination. Meanwhile, the younger feathers, who probably passed in less intentional and more happenstantial ways, simply remember their hopes as they were overall more innocent and probably were simply victims of unfortunate circumstances. Now, looking at the names of the older cast, we have train accident, jumping/falling, drowning, possible overdose, and light. which could be interpreted as either automotive or firearm related. And these are all grim reflections on real life tragedies and how such things can haunt people even so long after the actual occurrence. But what I especially want to note from these, though, whether or not these are self-inflicted ends, again, there's room for interpretation here, the ones that are self-inflicted are shown to have befallen upon people who are not necessarily bad, but just hurting. Rakka and Reki are the ones that are most likely implied to have wrapped things up themselves, but they're also shown to be great people. And they're also shown to be good people who simply struggle with their emotions at times, and especially with feeling alone. And I think what the show is saying here is that people who just feel so lost that they decide to end things don't do so because they're bad. They don't do so because they want to hurt those around them. They just do so because they're hurting and they might not necessarily know how to handle themselves the best. And it's important that people around them try to help them handle things properly so that these tragedies do not occur. This is not to place blame on anyone, because that's not the point of the show. But what the point is that regardless of why things are the way they are, it's important to reach out to people so that they know that they're cared for and that things like this don't occur. A reflection on this crisis could be seen as even more poignant considering that this is an anime, something that originates from Japan, which is a place and culture known to struggle with such issues especially. And the fact that it goes out of its way to display this devastating manifestation of emotional turmoil and how those experiencing it deal with it or may try to hide it along with their pain, it is a statement and series of events that is both scarring and yet rather bold, as it brings up something that no one wants to talk about, but something that we just can't ignore, and depending on circumstances, might need to have a real honest conversation about. Thankfully though, Haibane Renmei reminds us that this quagmire of uncertainty and anguish can be waded through and conquered. Not by seeking answers we will never find, or by taking our inner pain out on ourselves, but by eventually looking at the reality of loss and growing to accept it with the support of those around us, and cherishing our lives today. And this gets us to the most important scene in probably the entirety of the series, the well scene. Now in this scene, a Rakka, which is still distraught from Ku's disappearance, even months afterwards, falls down a well. She's trapped here to grovel in the darkness and extremely scared. All seems lost, and all seems hopeless, as it seems she'll be stuck here forever. This mirrors how even after a great deal of time, people can still feel trapped by their own personal tragedies and inner darkness, and they may feel as though they're stuck in a pit of despair. And then Rakka sees the bones of the crow from her dreams, which oddly enough sets her free. This crow tracked her down not out of vengeance, but to try and let her know that it forgave her for something in a previous life. What that was doesn't really matter. What matters though is that this literal manifestation of death is a reminder that the dead do not want us to weep forever. And while Rakka finally learns this, she does so while looking at its bones. But looking at the bird bones so bluntly, so head-on, is, in her own words, not as scary as she thought it would be. She finally sees death. She finally sees that she won't have all the answers. She finally sees the unchangeable nature of the past, and she finally sees that there are simply some things we will never get to do and never understand, and she sees it all before her eyes. But she also sees a crow that lived a great life, and one that went out of its way to tell her that she was not to blame for whatever happened in the past. She still sees the love that was once in that crow. And the stark imagery, as well as this realization that the crow did probably live a good life, or didn't seem to have any malice in its heart, makes this scene feel oddly peaceful. She does say that she thinks she should be scared or feel guilty, but instead feels oddly at peace. While she does feel bad for the bird, seeing it in this state is a stark reminder that what's done is done, and we need to move on by accepting the past and trying to adapt to it, whether it's learning, whether it's by improving ourselves, or simply letting go of things we will never understand. It's a simple reminder to us that we're all small when compared to the entirety of the world, and that a human can only learn so much. But also that that's okay, and that we can still live meaningful lives in the limited time that we are given, and that we should try to do so instead of spending all of our time fixating on pain. And she moves on after burying the crow, having learned her lesson and imparted it to the viewer. And this ties in to the more subtle lesson of the crow, as while an important point of the crow and the burial of the crow is accepting forgiveness, a more important and subtle point that the crow proves to Rakka is that she was never alone, and that someone cared for her enough in a past life to take the form of a bird just to let her know that she is loved and forgiven. No matter how alone and worthless she may feel, that's simply not the case. She has value and people do care. And this is easy to miss, as it seems like the main focus of the communicator's dialogue and the crow scene in general is forgiving Rakka. However, Rakka herself, while mourning the crow, states the realization that the crow wanted to let her know that she's not alone, and that although they may never knew who they were in their past lives, they certainly cared for each other, and the crow was certainly concerned about Rakka and wanted her to know that she's not alone. And this idea that you're not alone and that you will be missed is a very critical but subtle one woven throughout the context of the story. Feelings of loneliness are implied to have led to the perhaps intentional deaths of many of the Haibane in the real world. And even in this world, it's something which Reiki and a lot of the other characters comment on quite a bit. Loneliness has a real power, and the crow is here to tell us, and Rakka, we're not as alone as we think, and it's important to open up our hearts to the love of others and to ourselves so that we can overcome the sometimes crippling loneliness we might feel. Because while loneliness is strong, it can be overcome. However, if it's not overcome, it can lead to unfortunate tragedies. Tragedies which are the subtle context and setup to this series as a whole. And this is the true beauty of the crow scene, as Rakka is not only learning to accept the loss and move on with her life, but to appreciate the love that came from someone close to her before they were lost. To realize that she is not alone, and that she was never alone, and is loved, is the key to escaping the cycle of sin and successfully atoning. One needs to not only recognize their error, but have someone to help them through it so they don't just collapse in on themselves out of guilt or loneliness. With external support, it is capable of overcoming these things and truly improving yourself. However, with a closed-off heart, feelings of loneliness can often intensify and even lead to such unfortunate conclusions, which are implied to have befallen a lot of the Haibanes before they arrived in the village of Gile. We will all have pain, but wallowing in the well of despair forever will trap us within it and prevent us from living any more past that point. At some point, we need to look upon the source of our pain and come to terms with it somehow. Now, of course, everyone should grieve. The grieving cycle is very important, but one needs to eventually emerge from it, and one needs to eventually reach the final step of it, which is acceptance. We must all respectfully see to things like this, like how Rakka buries the bird, because avoiding the truth and lying to oneself constantly simply isn't sustainable. We must look at the past and move on from it and grow to make sure that we have better circumstances in our lives, or simply accept what we cannot change, because doing so not only honors the dead or honors past sacrifices, but also allows us to keep living in the present. It is only after Rakka does all of this that she's pulled from the well to resume her life. And I like how cold her rescue is, as none of the masked men even address her. They simply pull her from the well and then pretend nothing happened and walk away. It's very matter-of-fact and cold, just like the constant progression of time. While the impermanence of everything means that nothing good can last forever, though, it also means the same for bad things. It means that eventually the time will come where you can and will emerge from the pit. And I always saw this as proof that society, inertia, and our own spirit can keep us moving long enough, or at least treading water long enough, to reflect and get back on our feet. That sometimes we will stall or even regress, but that can be overcome. And this is enhanced by the advice that the communicator bestows upon Rakka. And from this point on, she starts to accept her loss and lack of answers, and she accepts that moving on and living for today is probably healthier than wading into the pit of despair. She becomes a much healthier and happy girl, eventually not only embracing these lessons, but spreading them to Reiki and getting her the help that she needs as well. Rakka and the themes attached to her are the heart of Haibane Renmei, showing us that character progression is a real thing, both in television like this and in the real world. And while we do change over time, we can change ourselves into better versions of ourselves. It's time we start to close up our little retrospective here, but before we do, it's time to take our customary look at the tertiary cast. Starting off, we have Hikari, who, while one of the main 5 Haibane, is the one that I honestly couldn't see any big attached theme to. Yes, I know Kanna got her own segment, but Kanna's dialogue does get some important points across to the viewer, and with Hikari, well, I mean, she's pleasant, but there was no real big takeaway from her character that I got. I mean, there might be, I'm not a professional, but there wasn't really one that I could take away, and that's why she's here. She is pleasant though, and I do think it's funny that she uses the Halo device to invent donuts. So, although not critical to the series, she is a nice part of it. And this also applies to Sumika, a very tertiary character who I thought I would bring up for some interesting logistical reasons. Now, Sumika is Nemu's boss at the library, although the two are extremely close, with Sumika even serving as some kind of mother figure even. And she's also a very interesting example of someone who's grown to accept the limited nature of human knowledge, as she once wondered what was beyond the walls and is fascinated by the theology of the world, and yet she doesn't let her limitations stop her from being happy, as she's very excited to start her own family, even if it is within the walls of the city. I like this because it's kind of an example of the philosophy of the show being lived out, and it's a very subtle example that isn't focused on too much. The show doesn't go out of its way to say, see guys, we have a point. It's just a nice, friendly reminder of some of the points of the show, and showing that it has confidence in its ideas. Sumika also brings up a very interesting logistical note, as she's pregnant, which means that the humans in this world seem to be baseline human, like they seem to be just normal humans, and that brings up a lot of questions about how they got here into this purgatory. Are they just volunteering to work with the Haibane, or are they also in purgatory? If so, wouldn't they also be Haibane? I don't know, and I know these questions are not answered on purpose, lots left intentionally vague, but it's just an interesting part of the world building and helps add mystery to the settings present. Next, let's get to Hyoko and Midori. Now, these two were childhood friends of Reki's, who helped her through some tough times, but then later grew estranged due to the fallout of their failed attempt to scale the wall. In this attempt, Hyoko almost died. Reiki feels almost crippling guilt about this, and Midori, who wasn't there, never forgave Reiki for this incident. This establishes the two as literal specters of Reki's past that she must make peace with in order to move on. And it should be noted that while Midori is bitter, Hyoko has nothing but concern for Reiki and goes out of his way to try and let her know it's okay. While they don't have the most developed characters on their own because they don't have that much screen time, they are essential from a logistical point of view, as they are what Reiki needs to confront, as they are characters Reiki needs to make peace with before she's able to fully make peace with herself. And it is nice seeing everyone reconcile here, and it is nice that they do reconcile. Finally, that gets us to the crows. Now, the crows of Haibane Renmei are one of the most interesting aspects of the series, and probably the one with the most possible interpretations. In this series, crows seem to hold a mystical place, as they are implied to be much more intelligent than they seem, and even go out of their way to convey certain points at times. Of all the cast of the series, they're probably the most mysterious, but they do seem to have a plan, which is left intentionally vague. I really like how, being the only creature to freely fly over the walls, there is an element of esoteric knowledge to them, as the crows, while not sinister, do seem otherworldly. They do seem a little out of place, and it does seem like they know more than they're telling us. In fact, the series goes almost as far as to straight up acknowledge this, as everyone to some extent sees the crows as essentially sentient, and one even tracks down Rakka to either try and save her, or forgive her, or both. This is the crow from her cocoon dream that she later buries, and what its motivations are not 100% clear. Now, it is clear that the crow from Rakka's dream wanted her to understand that it forgives her. That part is clear, but what's not clear is why this is the case, or what it's forgiving Rakka for, and all the past occurrences in their past lives that may have occurred to lead to these circumstances. But that's okay, this is left intentionally vague as part of the series' themes about getting over the past. So, from what I can tell, it seems simply that the crow wanted Rakka to feel forgiveness in order to help save her soul. They act as sort of spirit guides for Rakka, and it's very apt that these supposedly ominous birds are simply guiding her to making the sometimes difficult realizations and reflections that she needs. And once she does, the crows start to be less prominent, as they've gotten their message across, and now they're simply content to watch Rakka spread her own wings, so to speak. And both parties are now moving on with their lives. I really like how well they're handled. While they are definitely mysterious, they're never quite ominous or sinister, even though they might seem that way because of common cultural connotations that crows seem to have. They may be a bit off, but they're never malicious, and even though some characters dislike them, Rakka sympathizes with them from the start, establishing that they are at the very least neutral, and operate in odd but not malicious manners. And with that little look at the tertiary cast, we conclude our little retrospective on Haibane Renmei. Now, the series is only 13 episodes long, which is why this retrospective is a bit on the shorter side. I do apologize, it still took me about a month to get it out, but I'm glad that I did get it out because I'm glad that I saw this series. Haibane Renmei is one of the most beautiful and bizarre things I've ever seen, not on this channel, but in my life. And I stand by that it's probably one of the most beautiful things because of its messages and how it portrays them. It's an extremely unique piece that predicates its success on doing its own thing, often going against the grand trends of a medium that's known for its grand trends. Instead, it's a series that focuses on the small and on the emotional. But it doesn't get emotional to the point of being unrealistic. In fact, a lot of the emotions in the series feel very real and very relatable, and I think that's why the story stuck to me so much. Because there's real passion that went into making it, and there's real emotions and feelings that we can get from it. There is no real antagonist here. There's no real anime powers. Heck, there's not even much of a plot, and the world building is left intentionally vague. But all of these seemingly weak aspects of this story are some of its greatest strengths, focusing our attention on some of the most touching character developments and impactful messages I've seen in a while. This is a series that has mastered literal and metaphorical storytelling. It has layers so that we can understand and appreciate its complexity, but that complexity is not to the point of being obtuse or anything like that. It wants to be accessible because it wants to give us important messages, and it wants to help us live our lives in a healthier manner. Haibane Renmei is proof that something doesn't need to be the biggest or flashiest or most complex production to be memorable and to be gracious. Something just needs a good heart, good intentions, and good communications to be so. I will stand by my statements that I think this is one of the most feel-good anime ever, and that it might even restore some faith in humanity. And this is even more impressive considering how dark and bizarre it might seem on a surface level. It is a story which takes place in a purgatory full of dead children, and yet even out of this, it gleams light from the situations that happen and proves that there is some kind of inner light within all of us that hopefully we can grow to appreciate and harness to live better lives. There are dark elements in here, but they're addressed by the show relatively openly, and while these elements could have exploited to create a darker or edgier story, they never are, showing that maturity and edge or gloom are not necessarily connected. There's no guile here, there's no catch. This is just a very caring and inspiring piece. Although it may feel at times like we're waiting for it to take a dark turn that it never recovers from, it never does, and it proves that recovery from grief, from loss, is actually something we're all capable of achieving, even if we do need a little help from time to time in order to do so. And I think this kind of mature restraint is one of the reasons I love it so much. It's a show with little, if any, blood and swearing, yet it's very precise and honest and caring, and all of these display to us that it has confidence in its message and what it wants to say. It has a coherent idea, and it knows what it is. And all of this displays a maturity that's easy to appreciate and sometimes hard to find. It feels like a piece with a vision. It feels like it wants to tell us that everything's going to be okay. And it seems like it does so by showing people getting over their own losses in a relatively realistic manner. And yet, it's also a piece that respects and cares about us enough to convey these in a very warm but blunt fashion. I think the blunt nature of how Haibane Renmei handles some real-life tragedies like self-harm and isolation are actually one of the reasons I love it so much. It doesn't talk on these sensitive ideas for the sake of shock value or other exploitive purposes, but it genuinely wants us to understand and know they exist. It wants to have a genuine conversation about these things and help us through them, or let us understand that if someone's going through these kind of things, we can help them, and that the pit of despair is something that can be crawled out of. It doesn't shy away from important conversations because, as the show proves, having an honest conversation is often the first step to making any sort of recovery from anything. And I love this open, positive message. It's one that's realistic because it takes time, even in series, but it's one that is applicable to our real life, and I think it's one that some of us really need to hear from time to time. It's not a show that beats down its characters for feeling down. It wants to build them up instead, and through building them up, help us learn how to build ourselves up and build up those in our lives. It's a refreshing amount of pure-hearted goodness and honesty For any kind of media, and it's a refreshing piece in general, it's always easy to be a cynic. And I'm glad that pieces like Haibane Renmei exist to remind us that not everything is horrible, or at least it won't be forever. And for that reason, it is one of the most beautiful and touching of any obscure anime memory.